Good evening to folks who are joining us from the East Coast. It's the middle of the night here in Israel, where I and one of our guests, Rabbi Brody, are. It's a tough time, and we're honored to have some very special guests with us to help us better understand what's going on. I spoke last week about thematically how Simchat Torah, the holiday of Simchat Torah, begins with the death of Moses in the Torah reading and then moves to creation. And that for many people, we sort of only stopped in the middle with just the sense of death and mourning. Creation itself, though, is also something which is rather complicated, potentially ongoing. In a remarkably profound book, which I encourage everyone to take a look at, Harvard professor John Levinson writes in his book, Creation and the Persistence of Evil, that when order emerges where disorder had reigned unchallenged, when justice replaces oppression, when disease and death yield to vitality and longevity, this is indeed the creation of something out of nothing. Throughout the book, Levinson argues that the vanquishing of disorder that defines creation is not a single everlasting event. Rather, the world is in flux. He writes that often in the Hebrew Bible, quote, we find a jarring juxtaposition of the affirmation of God's world-ordering power and the grim reality of historical experience. And the remarkable point is the refusal to choose between faith and realism. Levinson argues throughout the book that creation itself continues on as the vanquishing of evil, as the vanquishing of disorder, into turning that into order. I spoke a little bit last week about how I've seen some tremendous examples already here in Israel of people trying to make order out of disorder. And just one more that I wanted to share here this evening. A few hours ago, I saw a WhatsApp message. Someone from down south who had been displaced was getting married, and they were afraid there would be no guests at the wedding. So they sent a message out over this volunteer WhatsApp group. I got to the wedding at around 9:30 here in Israel, and it looked like any other wedding. It was full, and there was a band and hundreds of people there dancing. And almost all of them, I think, were really guests who just heard the message and came out to make this couple happy and celebrate even in this dark time. One other way that we try and make order out of disorder is in the sphere of the intellectual. Right now, there's a lot of sense of chaos on a moral level here in Israel. People don't know exactly how Israel should act, and many of us are deeply troubled. And we have with us this evening two incredible members of the Harvard alumni community who can help us shed some wisdom on this situation. I first want to thank our co-sponsors here, the Edmund and Lily Safra Center for Ethics, and also AMATI, which is the organization Rabbi Brody, one of our guests, runs now. So our guests this evening are Professor Emeritus Michael Walzer. He's Professor Emeritus from the Institute for Advanced Study in Princeton and one of America's foremost political thinkers. He received political philosophy. He received his PhD from Harvard and also taught here for 15 years. He's the author of over 25 books, including Just and Unjust Wars, War, Politics, and Morality, and Arguing about War. Currently, he's working on issues having to do with international justice and the connection of religion and politics, and on a collaborative project focused on the history of Jewish political thought. We also have Rabbi Dr. Shlomo Brody, an alum of Harvard College. He's the executive director of AMATI, a nonprofit organization dedicated to helping people navigate their healthcare journey with Jewish wisdom. A columnist for the Jerusalem Post, his first book, A Guide to the Complex Contemporary Halachic Debates, received a National Jewish Book Award, and his next book, Ethics of Our Fathers, A Jewish View of War and Morality, will be released soon. In addition to being a graduate of Harvard College, he received an MA in Jewish philosophy at the Hebrew University, a PhD from Bar Ilan University Law School, and his rabbinic ordination from the Israeli Chief Rabbinate. Dr. Walzer and Rabbi Brody, thank you so much for joining us.
We're happy, both of us, I think, to be with you. I wish this was a
And
more theoretical conversation, but it's wonderful to be together and a particular honor to join Professor Walzer to discuss these issues.
one note, both Rabbi Brody and I are in Israel, and there may be a siren that we'll hear, in which case we'll have to I'll run downstairs to a shelter. So if I kind of duck off screen, I'm likely safe, but just want to give a little warning about that. And for those of you who are joining us for the first time, we'll have a chance to have audience Q&A later this evening. There's a Q&A icon at the bottom of your screen, so you can click on that icon and type in your question. Do so by name, not anonymously. And if we select your question later, we will promote you, turn you into a panelist, so you can actually turn on your audio and video and ask your questions directly to our panelists. Michael, I want to begin this evening at a real fundamental level. What are some of the basic principles of just war theory in general? And what are some principles that are unique to the circumstances we're seeing here today with Israel and Hamas, where a conventional army is fighting an insurgency?
Yes, well, I will answer those questions, or try to, with an example, since I don't like abstract philosophical talk. So let's take the Russian-Ukraine war. Russia is fighting a classic unjust war, a war that practically defines injustice, a war aimed at conquering or subduing an independent state, creating a Soviet-style satellite or Tsarist-style province of a Russian empire. Therefore, the resistance to Russian, the Ukrainian resistance, is a classic example of a just war, even a just and necessary war. The Russian war also exemplifies injustice in the conduct of a war. They have abducted children and carried them back to Russia. They have tortured and murdered prisoners of war and even civilians who oppose them. They have bombed hospitals and schools. This is exactly the kind of behavior that we want to call unjustified in the conduct of war. And it is important to stress that Ukraine is a state with a military establishment that is entirely separate from civic society, that has its own bases and its own buildings, so that when the Russians bomb a hospital or a school, we know they are doing that intentionally because there is no military connection with those institutions. So Ukraine, Russia, here we have a virtual example, an exemplary example of the theory. It tells us pretty much all we need to know about the basic definitions of justice and injustice. But this is a conventional war, entirely unexpected in the heart of Europe, an old-fashioned war, even sometimes a trench war. Asymmetric warfare is fundamentally different in the most important way, that one side is fighting without any distinction of military and civilian life. We have a war between a high-tech army and a low-tech insurgency. The low-tech insurgency fights, the low-tech insurgents fight from civilian cover. The high-tech army does most of the killing. The insurgents put civilians at risk, and then they are killed in the course of, we will have to talk about this, the response of the high-tech army. And in these wars, despite everything that is said about the might of high-tech armies like the American Army or the IDF, the high-tech armies usually lose these wars, as America lost in Vietnam and in Afghanistan, or the high-tech army fails to win, as Israel has several times failed to win a decisive victory in Lebanon and in Gaza. So this is a war that is enormously difficult to fight for the high-tech army and is deliberately made difficult by the low-tech insurgency, which benefits politically, if not militarily, from every civilian death. And that's the dilemma that the Americans faced in Afghanistan and previously in Vietnam, and that Israel faces today. And I hope we will have some time to talk at length about what that means.
So Rabbi Brody, I'm wondering if you can sort of chime in, and much of traditional Jewish thought, rabbinic literature was written at a time where there was no sovereignty and Jews were not waging war. Is there anything in traditional Jewish sources, some major principles that would help guide how a country like Israel should conduct this war?
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, when I told friends that I was writing a book, which is now coming out as Ethics of Our Fighters, which is obviously a play on the term Ethics of Our Fathers, we usually think of Jews as providing general aphorisms, but not having some form of distinct moral teaching when it comes to the political realm and certainly the military realm. So I told people I'm writing a book on this. They said, well, that's going to be a very small book because there ain't much to say about it. But the truth is that despite the fact that we didn't have much sovereignty for many years and we didn't have a political opportunity to fight wars, just or unjust as it may be, particularly over the last 100 years, as Jews have engaged in warfare, even beforehand, but certainly since World War I, we have been able to develop, actually, I think, a Jewish perspective on some of the key questions that relate to warfare, both on when we go to war and, of course, how we fight a just war, how we fight the conduct of the war. And I think everyone would agree that Israel, in this particular case, has the right to fight, to defend itself. I don't think that's really so much in debate, at least in the civilized world right now. And so really one of the critical questions is going to be not so much should Israel fight, but how does Israel fight? Meaning, what's our conduct and what should we set up as our goals? And I'd say that within Jewish thought, as within many other realms of Jewish thought, not just in military thought, we have a situation where we don't have one particular value or goal that's overriding and that is guiding everything, but a number of different values or goals that sort of stand out in terms of how Jews think about, and rabbinic Jews, right? Jews think about in terms of classic terms, think about warfare. And I start with noting the dignity of mankind, that all human beings were created in the image of God. And this is a critical value for us to always recognize, even when we're speaking about our enemies. And I'm stressing this in particular because sometimes you hear within Israel, and I totally understand where it's coming from, describing the other side as animals, or they're behaving like animals. It's a very dangerous rhetoric. We have to recognize that our enemies, and a particular enemy nation, all of us were created in the image of God, which gives us inherent dignity. And we should recognize that people can sometimes desecrate the dignity that they are created in, right? They can behave in a horrific manner, as we've seen in the past week, but all human beings are created in the image of God. It's important for us to keep that in mind. We don't want to illicitly kill people. That's a major principle, lo tirtzach, do not murder. And we really want to, in general, hold only those who did the wrong actions to be responsible, right? We want to hold them responsible and not think of this in terms of, oh, let's just kill everyone, right? So the notion of let's just bomb Gaza, right? You hear this idea, right? Sometimes people throw it out there. It's an intuitive idea, right? Of course, it's something that people have. They want to have revenge. We shouldn't be speaking in terms of revenge, right? We want to have individual responsibility because we have a vision of world peace, right? That is something we do care about. All of that being said, and here comes the balance to this. While those values are all true in Jewish thought, there's an understanding that sometimes warfare is going to be necessary for the sake of pursuing justice. And we're going to also notice that warfare is going to be, by its nature, a collective affair. I mean, we have nearly 500 people on this call right now, on this webinar. I imagine that the people who are joining this, many of whom feel personally engaged in this issue, even though they're not personally endangered by this issue, because people have a collective identity with Israel or with the Jewish people, and that's part of the nature of warfare. Warfare is a collective affair, and we have to recognize that, along with the partiality that's going to come about from that. We have associative obligations, philosophers like to call that. We have certain priorities in our ethical obligations, which is going to be part of what's going to guide us in some of these difficult decisions we're going to have to make. And here I want to stress two last things, and I think in the Jewish vision of warfare, which is that we have a fear of killing illicitly. We do not want to murder, but the Bible nonetheless calls upon us sometimes to fight, and to fight with bravery and courage, in the hope and the belief that we can fight an ethical war, even though that's going to involve complex moral decisions. Right? That's a very difficult position to be in. Israel is certainly in that position right now. And part of what we're going to try to do when we fight is to defend our national honor, which is a Jewish value. But national honor, we should understand, both means to being a proud and strong people, not to be downtrodden as we were for many generations, but also to be a people to defend our honor who behaves and fights ethically. And therefore, national honor in that respect is a double-edged sword in some ways. Right? We need, on the one hand, be strong, be safe, be sovereign, and at the same time be worthy of that sovereignty on a moral level. And so I think the way I like to think about the multi-frame, I guess I call it Jewish way of thinking about military ethics, is that we have all of these values, which I think many of us can relate to in different ways. And the question then that's going to become, the difficult question, which we have to figure out, is how do we apply these values and how do we prioritize these values in a complex military situation?
So, Michael, I'd love to hear your response. And I think, this big question of how we balance these values, that's really where the crux of this is. So in your years of thinking about these issues, what are some of the core principles that would guide an army fighting an insurgency to do so morally and justly?
Yes, well, I think I agree with everything that Rabbi Brody said. But I think what he was giving us was a humanist perspective. In truth, there is nothing in Jewish tradition comparable to Catholic just war theory for obvious reasons. The Catholics fought a lot of wars, some of them ugly, but they also had a lot of people reflecting on wars and talking about the ugliness. And we did not have many wars, and we did not have a state, and we were the victims of many wars, but not the perpetrators of many wars. And we do not have a body of reflection. So my work on war has been a kind of secularized version of Catholic just war theory. And some of the things we'll be talking about today, like dirty hands and proportionality and double effect, come out of Catholic theology. And I think it's important to recognize that. Now, the crucial principle is to do everything you can to minimize, or yes, I guess the word has to be minimize, civilian casualties. In modern warfare, there is no way to avoid civilian casualties. You can imagine a war fought in a desert or a war at sea where there were no civilians nearby. But in the wars that Israel has had to fight, in the wars that America has had to fight, the presence of the civilian population poses the crucial issue. How do you fight against an enemy that tries not to distinguish itself from the civilian population. And I'm not sure I want to anticipate things that in your instructions for this, for this little seminar supposed to come later. But I think
you can jump in, so we can start with either proportionality or double effect. I think that'd be helpful.
It is enormously important to talk about the crucial question that is debated in the American Army. I have participated in those debates and in the IDF, and I have participated from a distance in those debates. What risks can we ask our soldiers to take in order to minimize the risks they impose on a civilian population that is being used, willingly or unwillingly, by the enemy as camouflage and cover? What risks? And that is it's an agonizing question, especially if you think of the junior officers in a field who have to ask some of their soldiers to take those kind of risks. And again, I suppose I had better turn quickly to an example. And I'll take an example from Afghanistan. I was visiting the Army War College in Pennsylvania, and I met with a colonel who was just back from Afghanistan, and he described the following situation. American troops take fire from a rooftop, from the rooftop of what looks like a small apartment building. In the old days, this colonel said, we would just pull back and call in the artillery. And maybe there were people in the building and they would get killed, maybe, but we would get the bad guys on the roof. Now, the new laws of engagement, rules of engagement promulgated by General McChrystal in 2010 or 2011 forbid us from doing that. So what is the alternative? You have to ask a soldier to run undercover to the entrance of the building and to find out if there are families inside. Or you have to get soldiers on the rooftop where they parallel to the building where the bad guys are firing, and so that you can fire directly at them without affecting families in the house. Both of those options require a soldier or a group of soldiers to take risks that they would not face if we simply called in the artillery. And there were reports back in 2010 and 2011 written from New York Times reporters saying that American soldiers were very unhappy about these new rules. It made it possible, necessary to take, it made fighting much more dangerous. And yet I think those rules are the right rules and that they apply to any army fighting against insurgents who do the equivalent of firing from the roof of a house in which there may be men, women, children hiding or just living. Those are the kinds of questions that we now have to face. And they are hard questions. And some time ago, Avishai Margalit and I published an article in Haaretz describing situations like this and arguing that Israeli soldiers had to take risks of this sort. We couldn't define how much risk. It's not 23 or 47. There's no precision here. A lot depends on the intelligence of the commander, maybe 24 years old, a lieutenant or a captain. A lot depends on his wisdom. But we argued that soldiers had to take the kinds of risks that I described, and we provoked a controversy. I was very proud that several generals in the IDF supported our position, And there were philosophers and other military officers who strongly opposed it and who argued that enemy civilians being used by let's say, by Hamas are now the responsibility of Hamas, and that the IDF or the Americans in comparable situations should fight a war that minimizes risks to their own soldiers, and any civilian deaths are the responsibility of in this case, of Hamas. And I certainly want to recognize the responsibility of Hamas when it deliberately puts civilians at risk, and because it benefits from their death. It benefits politically from the death of the people it pretends to be defending. On the other hand, precisely because it benefits, there are prudential reasons as well as moral reasons to take these extra measures to try to prevent civilian deaths.
Well, I appreciate the example that Professor Walzer gives, and I certainly understand where the sentiment's coming from. When Professor Walzer published that piece in Haaretz, there was some philosophical pushback here from Asa Kasher in Israel and others. And I'd say that I think in the rabbinic world, and at least where, forget the broader rabbinic world, from where I sit and think about these issues, I think there needs to be a bit of pushback. And I think the heart of the controversy lies in the following. I think Professor Walzer, your formulation was correct. The heart of the matter, he said, was how do we minimize civilian casualties? Now, of course, we want to minimize enemy civilian casualties because we believe in the dignity of human beings, that human beings are created in the image of God. There are also prudential reasons as well, strategic reasons we want to do that, but on a fundamental moral level, we want to minimize. But again, the balance of values, one of those values that we really care about is we sometimes refer to as force protection, or of protecting our own troops, which of course Professor Walzer and others also care about, right? It's obvious as well. But I think here there's been some pushback on we are risking too much and asking too much from our soldiers. And it's very costly in human lives. It's costly in our human lives, in the morale of our soldiers and of our people. And I think here there's going to be some pushback. And I think I predict, it's hard to know, but in this current war, that if Israel does have a ground invasion, which seems to be where it's headed, there's going to be push to say we need to err more on the side of force protection. Now, that doesn't mean that we're not going to ask our soldiers to take risks. That's certainly the case. But what's happened over the past 3-4 rounds with Hamas is a sentiment of a feeling that we are doing too much to protect the other side, so to speak, and not doing enough to protect our soldiers. Because when Israel loses soldiers, and this is true about America, but I'm speaking here particularly from Israel, when we lose our soldiers, it's not just the loss of a soldier. It causes a deep sense of not only loss of morale, but a sense that we cannot defeat this insurgent enemy. And the feeling I feel in Israel right now, and I see from the Shiva calls I'm making, frankly, the families who are killed over the last week, is that everyone is saying on the right, on the left, religious, not religious, do not let these deaths go in vain. This time it has to end differently. That's a dangerous thing to say, right? It's a dangerous thing to say because it might push you to say, we're going to do whatever it takes, and sometimes whatever it takes will make you do something which is questionable morally. But I think that the feeling is that we cannot allow this insurgency from Hamas, which, while not that sophisticated, showed a lot of sophistication on that Saturday. I mean, it was a pretty impressive, from a military level, barbaric, but pretty impressive accomplishment. And the feeling now is that we have to not only prioritize minimizing civilian casualties, we have to prioritize making sure that we win. We must win this time. This isn't just mowing the lawn. And so it's a nerve-wracking, and I know Professor Walzer cares about winning and he wants, right? And this is a balance of values here. But I think that we need to err here, or at least err more on the side of force protection and err on the side of understanding that we cannot afford not to win. It cannot end in a stalemate this time.
Right. Well, I don't think of force protection as a particularly Jewish value. It's a value of every army in the country, in the world. And I have to say, it's the value of every army that has lost one asymmetric war after another. Precisely by protecting its forces and killing masses of civilians. That's the way you lose a war. Let's think for a moment about police forces and fire departments. When there are policemen ready to risk their lives to save innocent civilians, when there are firemen ready to rush into a building, that's when morale is highest in police departments and fire departments. And I suspect when the sense of honor of a soldier means that in some circumstances, they will take risks to save even enemy civilians. That's an example of high morale. Not only of morality, but of high morale. So I agree, these are hard decisions. And I certainly recognize that I cannot tell anyone in any army what degree of risk is right. And by the way, the article that I wrote was co-written with Avishai Margalit. I do not sit in New York and tell the Israeli soldiers what to do. I work with my friends, I support my friends, I try to help my friends. And that's been my political relationship to Israel from literally the beginning.
Yeah. Oh, no doubt. I mean, there's a balance here. I do agree, and I feel this with Israeli soldiers. I think this is true with other soldiers as well from moral countries. There is a pride in acting ethically. There's a morale from that. That's something that Israel, Torah HaNeshek, purity of arms, is something that Israelis take pride in. That needs to be preserved, right? That mentality. The question is just a matter of a balance of risks here and how we're going to play that out. And you know, one of the open questions, which is all in some ways impossible to answer, right? Sort of theoretical, is the overprotection of worrying about collateral damage, right? We should never, and I think we all agree on this, we should never target enemy civilians. The question here is about how much are we going to do to avoid what we know is collateral damage of civilian casualties, which are inevitable. We want to minimize them. The question is, would our greater error on the side of military effectiveness, greater error on the side of force protection, give us a greater military advantage or not? And that's an open question. These are difficult wars to fight. They're difficult wars to fight precisely because of the nature of the enemy and the territory we're trying to do. And so, you know, the open question, of course, is if we can have everything, if we can win these wars and minimize civilian casualties, of course, that's what we should do. But if we have to choose right now, if we have moments of choice, right, where's the error going to be on the spectrum here? And here, I think there's going to be this big question right now. And that's an open question, I think, that we're going to have to see in how it plays out right now.
Okay, I agree it's an open question. I would just remind you of a line from an American colonel in Afghanistan in 2010. The more civilians we kill, the more certain it is that we will lose the war.
Yes, that's true. That might be true in that case when you're in a country that's fighting somewhere 3,000 to 4,000 miles away, 6,000 miles away, whatever it is. Israel is fighting right now on its border. And it's very different than America. You're right, civilian casualties cause all sorts of, it increases number of terrorists, it causes a lot of problems, right? On a strategic level, it's something we want to avoid. We all agree with that. But we just lost more Jews on a single day than we ever have since the Holocaust. In a butcherous manner. We said for years, Hamas is ISIS, but I don't think actually we believed it because we thought it'd never come to that. And now we see Hamas is ISIS. And we have ISIS literally on our border, a mile away, right, from our villages. That cannot exist at the end of this process.
I agree with that. There was a pogrom, and because the state of Israel exists, this pogrom will not go unpunished. And that's very important. But the punishment has to be proportionate. I don't want to use that word. The punishment has to be addressed to the perpetrators with every, well, we don't disagree, with every possible effort to preserve the lives of innocent civilians.
Michael, I wanted to follow up. I was a bit surprised. You just answered, you said that by acting in a way that soldiers assume some risk in order to prevent the loss of civilian lives, that ups morale and improves the chances for winning. But in the preface to your last edition of Just and Unjust Wars, you wrote the Russians, or you said, throughout history, the army, meaning the advanced army, rarely defeats the insurgents. The Russians in Chechnya and the government of Sri Lanka in its war against the Tamil rebels demonstrate that these wars can be won by a modern army, but can they be won by an army committed to just rules of engagement? So when I read that, I thought the argument was that if you're prepared to be brutal like the Russians, you can win. And the question is, how much morality is one prepared to sacrifice in order to be victorious? I'm curious, has your thinking evolved over, I think that was maybe 7 or 8 years ago?
It is true. I've avoided saying it. If you kill enough civilians, if you destroy the civilian cover, you can win. But that enough means hundreds of thousands. The Sri Lankans killed at least 100,000 civilians. And look, America can't do that, and Israel certainly can't do that. So it's just, I've just sort of put that aside because it isn't relevant to countries like ours.
So I certainly understand. So I want to follow up on that. You then continue in that paragraph, the next paragraph, answering this question: can war be won by an army committed to just rules of engagement? And you answer, in asymmetric warfare, the responsibility to judge the war, to join the arguments about how it is being fought, extends more widely. The world's judgments are important, and if the world gets things right, the war will probably end with justice done. Looking at the Israeli-Gazan war and the sentiment around the world, at Harvard's campus and elsewhere, do you think the world is getting it right? And do you have faith that the war will end with justice done?
I don't know if the world is getting it right. It didn't get any of the previous Israeli wars, Lebanon or Gaza, right. I wrote an article just a couple of years ago on asymmetric warfare and its journalists. Journalists turn out to be very important in asymmetric warfare because they tell the world how the war is being fought, or they pretend to. And often they don't tell the world how the war is actually being fought. There is a very interesting article years ago published by a very smart journalist who read hundreds of dispatches on one of the Gaza wars, the war before the last one. And he concluded that most of the journalists reporting from Gaza never dared, because of Gaza's censorship and Hamas censorship and repression, never dared to describe where the missiles were being launched from. But when they got home, if you continued to read them after they got home, the war was over, then you got reports very clearly stating by journalists in odd places like Finland and India and Latin America, I watched missiles being launched from hospital parking lots and schoolyards and from residential areas with children playing 100 feet away. So yes, journalists, the world is watching, and it is very, very important that the story of what is actually happening gets out. I don't know how to guarantee that. In Vietnam, the story got out. Reporters just ignored army repression, army censorship, and they told Americans what was happening in Vietnam, and that was an important contributor to the opposition, the domestic opposition, which helped to end the war. Israel has not had journalists around the world telling people what is actually going on. And the army spokespeople have often not been quick enough and not detailed enough and not informative enough to make up for what the falseness or the inadequacy of even journalists from the New York Times, the Washington Post, in fact, especially those, because they are people who don't go home. The people writing about this war from Gaza for the New York Times are probably residents of Gaza. They're not going to go home and tell us a year from now what was really going on. So yes, that it is a major problem. And so far, I don't think Israel has solved the problem.
I don't think Israel's going to be able to solve that problem. I think we agree with that a problem. And I think one of the biggest challenges we have to face is, I mean, the world right now is sympathetic to Israel because of the story of the hostages and because of the brutality of the initial raid. That narrative is going to change in the world press from evidence based on what we've seen in the past, the nature of social media today and how we can get false information or biased information out there. And I think Israeli Hasbara has improved in some respects. In other ways, it's fighting a really difficult uphill battle. And I think on a moral level, not just a strategic level, but on a moral level, we have to build up our fortitude to say that we're going to go against the grain of the world, including some of our allies at some point, if we think that continuing the battle is going to be necessary. I mean, this is a major issue because the CNN effect, so to speak, has always hurt us. The images are going to be coming out of Gaza are not going to be pleasant. No matter how careful Israel tries to be, they're not going to be pleasant. And on a moral level, though, we owe it to our citizens and to our soldiers to continue to fight, and to fight ethically, of course, right? But to continue to fight even against the bad CNN effect, right? The bad image that we're going to be having. I don't see how Israel, on a moral level, if you bring your soldiers to war and you endanger your citizens, you can allow the world opinion that's based on certain biases of the images and the media and whatnot to let you stop fighting until you've accomplished your goals. It's a moral problem for leaders to have to deal with that. I get it. It counts. It matters. It's important what the world says. But nonetheless, and this is a decision which I don't want to get political, but I'm afraid that Prime Minister Netanyahu has not always shown the backbone to go the level that's necessary, and we'll see what happens this time.
Well, you may be right. I think Israel has more friends than it realizes. But it doesn't know how to talk to its friends.
Hmm.
I think there is a reservoir of support which can be mobilized, but isn't mobilized if we run around wringing our hands and saying the world is against us. Actually, it isn't against us. Some part of the world is against us. We have a crazy infantile left in the United States that is enormously hostile to Israel. And there is, even on the left, a very substantial group of good people who support Israel and are eager to support Israel. Well,
I hope you're right. I hope you're right. But I'm not only worried about, the United States. There's also a lot going on in Europe, of course, which is an area of great concern. But I hope you're right. And I hope that the way that President Biden's coming now and the Chancellor of Germany came, and this is very significant. And Israel, you're right, has to utilize the good support of our friends in a wise manner. I'm wondering what you think, Professor Walzer, about the use even of the siege that Israel sort of put on, but restored the water back into, siege warfare is a complex matter because it causes so much harm to civilians. But it seemingly would be preferable than to actually have a ground invasion, which is really harmful. And so I think that's an interesting development already you're seeing in the way the world responds. I'm wondering what you feel about how that was, if that was done right, if that could be done right.
read the other day a paper from the Begin Sadat Center, not a lefty organization, criticizing the cutoff of electric power, and a strong critique, a prudential, political, and moral critique. Hamas has plenty of generators. This hurts the civilian population. It was wrong. And it's important for people to say, if the Begin Sadat people can say it, even you and I can say it, that was wrong. It should not have happened. Well, we all know, I'm sure you know, the famous line from Maimonides about siege warfare. It relates to cities, not a strip like Gaza. But Maimonides said memorably, a city can only be surrounded on 3 sides, which means it can't be surrounded on 3 sides so that people can escape, and presumably also so supplies can be brought in. Now that's the view of that's a refugee view. It's a diaspora view. It's not the view of a general or of a philosopher who talked with generals, but it is a characteristic Jewish view, and it should shape what we think about siege warfare.
I think it's a great example. I see we now go to questions, but I think it's a great example of a great Jewish sentiment. Comes even before Maimonides, that's trying to emphasize both on a strategic and a moral level why we want to minimize the injury and the harm that goes to non-combatants. But the same Maimonides also speaks of winning wars and destroying the enemy and uprooting evil. And it cannot just be about minimizing civilian casualties. It also has to be about winning the war as well. And I think on that, we agree.
Yes, we do.
Well, thank you both so much. We're going to probably only have time for a couple of questions. We'll start with Ofrit. Leviathan, please go ahead and ask your question. Thanks for joining.
So I'd like to ask my personal Mori v'Rabbi, Professor Michael Walzer, how do you foresee the ethics of war guiding the future battlefield now that we are in a global race to develop fully autonomous weapons that operate without human involvement? So how do you see that, your theories and others guiding that?
Yes, actually, Rabbi Brody has written a very fine article on this, with which I agree, though my impulse is to say this is a problem for the next generation, for people who know something about the technology, for my grandchildren to wrestle with. But my instinct, as I think Rabbi Brody's, is to say that we must not relinquish control of the power to kill to non-human agents. That is always the responsibility of human beings. And there must be accountable human beings. There must be human beings engaged the way only humans can engage in these kinds of decisions.
100% agree. And it's a great fear. I think we should be afraid of this notion of losing moral agency, human moral agency. And it's one of the things I think that Jewish ethical tradition, but other ethical traditions as well, understands the importance of keeping those decisions in the hands of human beings. We should be very wary of it.
Thank you, Ofrit. I'm going to turn now to Shani Bechhofer, an old friend, just promoting her to become a panelist. Shani, it's good to see you. Thank you so
Hi,
much
nice
for
to see
joining.
you too. This is such a fascinating talk. Thank you. I'm trying to remember which question this is. You had Dr. Walzer had talked about the olden days where you would call in the artillery, which would be, cause more civilian damage. I'm just wondering if you could say something about what you think about the current airstrikes, as opposed to, I hear that the ground forces going in is going to be worse, but I'm just wondering if you could address the current strategy with the airstrikes.
I am not there. I watch endlessly on television, and there are photos of apartment buildings just crumbling. And I do want to know, why was that building attacked? And I assume someone might be able to tell me or might not. And that would be the crucial, that would be what I would need to know. The bombing, as it is portrayed on American television, looks indiscriminate. I hope it isn't. If it is, there should be Israelis and Americans criticizing it. If it isn't, then we should be hearing from the IDF about exactly what they are targeting and why it looks so much worse than they, I assume, want us to think, so much worse than it is. But it looks awful.
Yeah.
Now I have previous experience with this sort of thing when American television would show, after some Israeli raid, rubble, a street of rubble. And then some other reporter would just lift the camera and the whole city was untouched except for this street of rubble. And the first reporter was quite unwilling to show us the untouched city. So that's what I need to know. Lift the camera, show me what is happening here and what is not happening elsewhere.
It's going to be a problem that we're going to see. We've seen already. We've seen it in press as well. We see an apartment building that's been crumbled. Why? Now, the assumption is that in somewhere of that 15 stories, right, 1 or 2 or 3 had some form of legitimate military target in there. I trust the IDF to be aiming at those types of buildings. I think that's a fair trust to have of the IDF. But winning that explanation war is a major, major challenge. And I don't think ground troops per se makes that better or worse. I mean, that's just a general question, is why are we aiming at certain buildings and not others? But being discriminative, of course, on what we target is crucial to acting in a just war, and behaving in a just way.
Shani, thank you so
Yeah,
much
okay.
for joining. Thank you both really for your tremendous insight and wisdom. It's a very difficult time, I know, for many of us, and we hope that others out there can turn to people like you to guide them in these moments. And ultimately that I think we may need some divine assistance in making sure that people can act appropriately. I do want to conclude. Last week, I meant to play a short clip from a wedding that I actually came to Israel originally to attend, and they moved it from the King David to just a small backyard, but just some bright light in a moment of darkness here. So I'll put that on in one moment, and with that we'll conclude. But I do just want to thank you, Professor Walzer, for joining us this evening. Really, you've been such a bastion of wisdom for so many years for so many people, and we are very, very grateful for your years of study and scholarship and writings, and for your joining us here this evening. And Rabbi Brody, for you as well, younger with years to go, God willing, and maybe you'll get to 25 books plus also. But in the meantime, thank you for joining us. Rabbi Brody will be joining us also tomorrow at 3 p.m. You'll get a link to that for a text study to address some of these issues, I think specifically sieges. So that'll be wonderful. Also, you'll get a link in your email. I want to wish everyone a good evening, and may we know of better times. But in the meantime, I'm going to share here this very sweet video. One moment. There we go. Good night, everyone.
Good night.
All right, thank you. Thank you, Professor Walzer.
Thank you. Hope